There was always just something eerie about my grandpa and his old house. You would just get this funny feeling the moment you stepped foot inside. For me, growing up, that feeling often came in the form of a sinking sensation that resided in the pit of my stomach. Other times it felt like an immense weight pressing down on my shoulders that left the instant we would leave. My dad would always chalk it up to me being silly, a kid simply trying to find any reason to avoid going to visit their grandpa. My mom, however, I knew she could feel it too. From the constant excuses she used to avoid coming along with us, to the way unease was painted across her face when she was anywhere near my grandpa. I had to believe she felt the same, although she never outwardly said anything. I never even understood why I was forced to go. My grandpa didn't even know who I was. At least, that's what he'd always say whenever he saw me. Half the time, he hardly even knew who his own son was. Dad had said it was because Grandpa was suffering from a sickness that made it difficult to remember things, especially loved ones. Which is why he never mentioned my grandma, whom he was married to for 10 years until she suddenly walked out on him and my dad. I never knew her aside from a few pictures Grandpa had of her in different photo albums. Dad also said that was why Grandpa always had such an empty look in his eyes. Practically every time we went to visit, Grandpa would be sat in his squeaky and faded red recliner and stare off into space. What would really creep me out about him the most was that the corners of his lips would twitch sporadically while he did it. To this day, there are not really many memories that stick out to me about him. Except for one. I can't remember what was going on before. The memory itself starts with me waking up in the car, in the back seat. Dad was driving, and Mom was sitting passenger, turned away and looking out the window away from both Dad and I. Dad met my gaze in the rearview mirror. "Listen, boy, your mother and I are going out on a date tonight. The sitter canceled last minute on us, so we decided to drop you off at Grandpa's for the evening." That was when my heart dropped into my stomach. Visiting Grandpa with Dad was one thing, but being left alone with him, that was another thing entirely. Despite being ready to protest, the feeling of not wanting to upset my parents superseded the feeling of dread that came with the idea of being with Grandpa for God knows how long. The next thing I remember is pulling into the old gravel driveway, Dad leading me out of the car and up to the old house. As soon as we got in, he took me into Grandpa's bedroom where he was sitting in his recliner, eyes staring off into the distance, his lips already twitching as he took in air through labored breaths. Dad walked over to him and spoke loudly. Pops, the wife and I are going to be out for a date tonight. Shouldn't be gone too long. The boy's gonna be in the living room watching TV. Alright?" Grandpa did little to acknowledge he understood what was said to him. His gaze remained unchanged. Dad placed a hand on Grandpa's shoulder and gave him a gentle kiss on the head before guiding me back into the living room to set the television to Cartoon Network, leaving Grandpa's room open just a crack. Before he left, I remember him squatting down to make eye contact with me. "Now listen, boy, I know your grandpa's very old and that can be freaky being left here on your own with him, but that's no reason to treat him like a ghost. Mind your manners, stay in the living room, and watch TV. If you need to use the bathroom, it's going to be the last door at the end of the hall. Alright? I'll see you later." And with that, he took off. closing and locking the front door behind him. Once I heard the car pull out of the driveway, the sinking sensation only intensified in my stomach. Though I knew Grandpa was in the other room, it felt as though he were watching me through the wall, which I knew wasn't likely because he was probably still staring off into space like he always did. I tried my best to focus on watching Ed, and Eddie to distract me from the unnerving feeling, and it worked for a good while. Until I had to go pee. Now, like my dad had told me, the bathroom was at the end of the hall, which meant I would have to pass the room my grandpa was in. I remember taking off my shoes so that I could tiptoe quieter against the squeaky hardwood flooring and made my trek to the toilet. Passing his bedroom, I saw through the small gap between the door that Grandpa was fast asleep in his recliner. His breathing still heavy and slow, and the corners of his lips still twitching. I scurried past, did my business, and was washing my hands when I realized there were no towels to dry my hands off. In the bathroom, there was a small door that I figured was where all the towels were kept, and I opened it. Inside was a small closet with dust-covered towels on a top shelf too high for me to reach. As I was about to shut the door again, something about the back wall of it seemed off to me, like it was out of place. Given that there were no shelves aside from the ones placed at the top, I walked right in perfectly and pressed my hands against it. The wall gave in against the weight of my push, and my heart leapt. I took a quick step back and looked back towards the bathroom door. I went back to make sure it was locked before returning to the closet. The more I pushed on it, the further the false wall went back until I heard a gentle clicking sound. I looked around the wall and stepped down into a small, dusty room that was faintly illuminated by the bathroom lights. Given all the cobwebs that were visible, it was clear that nobody had been down in that room for a long while. I looked about in what little light was given to me and could see dark markings along the walls, like little divots scratched into the walls with dark streaks running along them. I carefully felt my way around the room and stopped immediately when my hand brushed across something cold and metallic. I took a hold of it and pulled it closer to me, shifting to let the light hit it, and saw that it was a chain. My eyes, which were adjusting to the darkness, saw that one end connected straight to the wall. I carefully followed to the other end of it, and let out a scream when I came face to face with a dust-covered skeleton. I slipped on the ground with my socks and tumbled onto my back, scrambling away into the bathroom once again. I slammed the closet door shut and steadied my breathing. I can still remember the way that feeling of dread flowed through my entire being. I had completely forgotten that I was still in my grandpa's house and not in some awful nightmare. Carefully, I unlocked the restroom door and walked back out into the hallway. It had felt like I had spent hours in there, but from the daylight that peered through the windows, it couldn't have been more than a couple of minutes. Again, I tiptoed across the hall, careful to avoid it creaking, and past my grandpa's room, which was still ajar, just a crack. Going against every instinct in my body, I had turned slowly to peer into the room, and in an instant, my blood ran cold. The hairs on the back of my neck had stood straight up. Through the small gap, I stared into my grandpa's eyes, which were staring straight back at me. And there was a dark intensity that lingered just beyond his gaze that I had never seen in him or anyone for that matter. His lips were no longer twitching, but rather were perfectly curled into an awful gut-wrenching smile. He looked absolutely maniacal, like a predator ready to maul its prey. I screamed once more and ran for the front door, desperately fumbling with the lock before opening it and darting out into the yard. Hot tears were streaming down my face, and I was absolutely inconsolable, not knowing what else to do or where to go. I just sat there on the curb, waited, and cried. Dad returned a few hours later and immediately grew annoyed once he had seen my tear-riddled face. I did my best through fresh tears to explain all that had happened, but where once there was annoyance, now lay anger on Dad's face regarding my recap of the evening. He tried to get me to follow him back into the house to say goodbye, but I outright refused to go in, which made him even more livid. He walked in without me and did not return for a good while. I had stood near the car, wanting to go home and forget everything that had transpired that evening. Before I even thought to go in and check on him, he came back out and looked at me. "I don't know what you're talking about, boy. The only thing that was in that restroom closet was shelves and towels. I've had it up to here with your stories. Now go in there and say goodbye to your grandpa. And don't forget to thank him for taking care of you." I didn't even think to protest once I saw the anger that resided behind my father's eyes, deciding there was no way around it. Slowly, I walked my way back into that godforsaken house and into Grandpa's room by myself. He was back to sleeping, snoring softly. Getting closer to his side, I stood on my tiptoes to give him a soft kiss on his cheek when I heard the words that still haunt me to this day. "I'm glad you finally got to meet your grandma, boy." It took every fiber in my being to keep from shrieking right then and there. With the fear still lumped in my throat, I carefully crept back from him and darted out of the room and out of the house. The ride back home was silent and tense. Thankfully, Mom was there waiting and gave me the biggest hug. I couldn't help but break down then and there, which infuriated Dad. It just felt so ethereal to feel safe again. To be so far away from that monster I knew as my grandpa. Not too long after that incident, he passed away, and I didn't have to visit him anymore. Dad said he went peacefully, and that never sat right with me. In his will, Grandpa left the house to Dad, who didn't really have the money at the time to renovate it. For years, that house remained there, untouched, until Dad made a friend who was a contractor and was willing to help him remodel the aged house at a significant discount. Once the work had begun, is when things took a turn for the worse. I remember coming home from school late one night to my father sobbing uncontrollably in the kitchen, Mom rubbing his back and consoling him, though she wouldn't tell me until the next day when Dad was gone at work. Apparently, Dad's friend made a gruesome discovery while tearing up the bathroom of Grandpa's house. In the closet just behind the shelves was a side room that contained the chained skeletal remains of someone. Though the house had since been roped off by the police and the bones sent off for DNA testing, Dad was already certain of who they belonged to. Truthfully, we were all aware. Since the discovery, he called off the remodel of the home and asked if his friend could tear it down instead once the police gave the go-ahead, and he agreed without argument. He ended up selling the property to the first bidder and pretended like it no longer existed in the first place. Our family was never quite the same after that. In the years that followed, Dad took to heavy drinking, and Mom used that as her out to divorce him and move halfway across the country, thankfully taking me along with her. Though I don't hear much from him these days. I'm sort of glad for that, as awful as that sounds. It's just that the older he got, the more he started to look like his father. And frankly, I see enough of my grandpa in my nightmares, with those bloodthirsty eyes and that sinister smile.